Clint Eastwood had seen it all. Decades of Hollywood politics and media scrutiny had hardened him into a man who didn't flinch under pressure. But even for someone as seasoned as he was, tonight felt different. He sat in the green room of a high-profile talk show, adjusting the sleeves of his classic denim jacket. The invitation had seemed straightforward, an open discussion on modern media, Hollywood's influence on politics, and the shifting landscape of American values. But he wasn't naive. He knew these shows were often orchestrated to generate controversy, not conversation. As he stepped onto the stage, the atmosphere was charged. The lights were just a bit too bright, the audience's energy oddly expectant, and the host's smile too rehearsed. Clint took his seat and leaned back slightly, his rugged face unreadable. The opening questions were routine, predictable. The host, a polished journalist with a reputation for tearing into guests, eased into the conversation. So, Clint, you've never been one to shy away from controversy. You've been vocal about your political views, your stance on Hollywood's changing values. Some say you're out of touch. What do you say to them? Clint's expression remained steady. I say everyone's entitled to their opinion, but I've been around long enough to know that controversial just means you said something someone didn't like. The audience chuckled, but the host wasn't amused. Well, let's be real, the host continued, leaning forward. You've built a career playing the tough guy, but let's talk about reality. Do you think you'd have the same success if you were starting out today? Or do you think Hollywood has moved on from your brand of, let's say, old-school masculinity? Clint smirked, recognizing the bait. If I were starting today, I'd still work hard, tell good stories, and let the audience decide. The only thing that's changed is that now people expect you to apologize for who you are. And I don't do that. The host's smile thinned. The audience shifted. This was the moment they were waiting for. The confrontation. So, the host said, voice laced with subtle derision, you're saying Hollywood's problem is that people are too sensitive? I'm saying Hollywood's problem is it's more interested in controlling the narrative than telling the truth, Clint replied, his voice steady as a mountain. The tension in the room thickened. Another panelist, a younger filmmaker, chimed in, smirking. Come on, Clint, you're a legend, but let's face it, your time was different. Back then, people could get away with saying and doing things that wouldn't fly today. Maybe you're just not used to accountability. Clint exhaled slowly. Accountability? That's a fancy way of saying people don't want to hear uncomfortable truths anymore. But facts don't care about feelings. They never have. The audience reacted, some with murmurs of agreement, others with low grumbles of disapproval. The host saw his chance. Let's talk specifics then. You've criticized cancel culture before. But isn't it fair to say that people facing consequences for their words and actions is just justice? Clint leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. There's a difference between consequences and censorship. If you screw up, you take responsibility. But when people are silenced for having the wrong opinion, that's not justice. That's control. The panelists exchanged glances. The conversation was slipping from their grasp. Clint wasn't flustered, wasn't defensive. He was dismantling their narrative with calm, measured words. The host pressed harder. So you're saying that people shouldn't be called out for outdated offensive views? Clint chuckled, shaking his head. I'm saying people should think for themselves instead of letting media tell them what to think. That was the final push. The host turned to the audience dramatically. And there you have it, folks. Clint Eastwood, Hollywood icon, director, and apparently free speech warrior. The crowd laughed. Clint knew what this was. A setup. A performance designed to discredit him, to make him look like an out-of-touch relic. But he wasn't playing their game. Instead, he simply nodded, offering a small, knowing smile. You call it free speech like it's a bad thing. The segment ended. The cameras cut. The damage, they thought, was done. But what they didn't anticipate was what would happen next. The energy in the room thickened. The host, emboldened by the reaction, pushed further. You've been criticized for some of your statements in the past, particularly about masculinity, traditional values, and politics. Do you think that's why Hollywood is leaving you behind? Clint let out a quiet chuckle. It wasn't a laugh of amusement, but one of knowing. Hollywood's been leaving a lot of people behind, he said. It used to be about telling stories. Good ones, real ones. Now it's about telling people what to think. The host's smile faltered slightly. He hadn't expected Clint to be so composed. Well, isn't it fair to say that times change? That audiences are looking for new voices? Clint leaned forward just a little. Change is one thing, erasing is another. The audience was silent for a beat. The host shifted in his chair. He hadn't lost control yet, but he could feel it slipping through his fingers. So you're saying Hollywood is erasing certain voices? Clint nodded. Not just Hollywood, the media, the culture. If you don't say the right things, they'll try to make sure no one hears you at all. The host laughed, but there was nervousness beneath it. That sounds a lot like a conspiracy theory, Clint. Clint didn't smile. And yet, here we are. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut. The host scrambled for a response, but before he could form one, Clint continued, his voice steady. You invited me here to talk about my career, but you didn't want a conversation. You wanted a confession. You wanted me to apologize for not fitting the mold, for not saying the right things, for still believing in things that used to be called common sense. The host opened his mouth, but Clint wasn't done. But I'm not going to do that, because the truth doesn't need an apology. The air in the room seemed to still. The audience, trained to react at the right moments, was now unsure how to respond. A few hesitant claps started, but they died quickly, as if people weren't sure which side they were supposed to be on. The host shifted again, clearly searching for a way to regain control of the conversation, but Clint wasn't giving him the chance. You see, Clint continued, his voice calm but firm, Hollywood used to be about storytelling. It used to be about talent. You didn't have to pass a purity test to make a great film. But somewhere along the way, that changed. Now, if you don't fit the narrative, they try to push you out. The host quickly interjected. That's not entirely fair, Clint. There are more opportunities for diverse voices than ever before. Clint nodded. And that's a good thing. But why does making room for new voices mean silencing the old ones? I've got nothing against new talent, new perspectives. But if the only way to promote something new is by tearing down what came before, then we're not building. Clint paused for effect, letting the weight of his words settle. We're just destroying. The audience was listening now, really listening. The planned takedown wasn't going as expected. The host, sensing his grip slipping, decided to try one last move. He leaned in, lowering his voice slightly as if offering Clint an off-ramp. Clint, don't you think that maybe, just maybe, people want something different? Maybe they're just tired of the old ways? Clint's eyes locked onto him, unwavering. People want good stories. They want honesty. They don't want to be told what to think. They want to make up their own minds. And if that's considered old-fashioned, then maybe it's the world that's lost its way, not me. The silence that followed was deafening. The interview ended abruptly. The producers cut to commercial, and the moment the camera stopped rolling, the host's friendly facade dropped. Clint simply stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked off the stage, leaving the network scrambling to regain control of the narrative. Within hours, the clip was everywhere. The media spun it in every possible direction. Some outlets called Clint a fearless truth-teller. Others painted him as a bitter, out-of-touch old man. But what no one could deny was the reaction. The people weren't just talking about the interview. They were furious about how it had been handled. The audience saw the ambush for what it was, and the backlash against the network was swift and unforgiving. Social media exploded. Hashtags like Warner Stand with Clint and Clint Eastwood Unfiltered trended worldwide. Hollywood figures, politicians, and everyday fans weighed in. Some defended the host, arguing that Clint needed to be challenged, but a far larger wave of voices sided with Clint, calling out the media's bias and hypocrisy. Even people who didn't necessarily agree with Clint's views saw the way he had been set up. The network tried to do damage control, releasing statements insisting that the interview was fair and balanced. But leaked footage from behind the scenes told a different story. A crew member anonymously shared a clip showing the producers coaching the audience, instructing them on when to gasp, when to laugh, and when to react with shock. It was all orchestrated. The host, once a respected figure in journalism, found himself at the center of a controversy he hadn't anticipated. His credibility took a massive hit, with even his colleagues quietly distancing themselves. And Clint? He simply carried on with his life, unfazed by the storm he had left in his wake. Because Clint Eastwood had faced down tougher opponents than a smug TV host, and he had never lost a fight worth fighting. Clint Eastwood had seen storms before. He had ridden through the dust of the Old West, survived the cold scrutiny of the Hollywood machine, and stood his ground against forces far greater than a late-night talk show host. But as he watched the world react to his interview, he realized something. The battle wasn't over. Not yet. The media frenzy didn't die down. If anything, it escalated. The network doubled down, airing panel discussions filled with carefully selected guests who dissected every word Clint had said, twisting his statements, reframing his stance. He was called a relic, a stubborn old man clinging to a world that no longer existed. Some went further, trying to tarnish his legacy, digging through decades of interviews and roles, searching for anything they could use to paint him as problematic. But Clint wasn't worried. He had been through this before. And if they wanted to rewrite his story, he'd remind them exactly who he was. A week after the interview, Clint received a call from an unexpected source, an independent journalist with a massive online following, someone who had built a reputation on exposing the hypocrisy of mainstream media. Unlike the talk show host, this wasn't a man with an agenda. He was offering Clint something rare, a fair conversation. Clint agreed, not because he needed to defend himself, but because he believed in something bigger than his own reputation. He believed in truth. The interview was raw, unfiltered. There were no commercial breaks, no audience prompted to react on cue. Just two men sitting across from each other, discussing Hollywood, the changing landscape of America, and what it meant to stand by your values in a world eager to tear them down. Clint, the journalist asked, "Why do you think they came after you so hard?" Clint exhaled, shaking his head with a knowing smirk. "Because I didn't play their game. They wanted a villain. And when I didn't give them one, they tried to make me into one." "But you're not afraid to be disliked," the journalist pressed. Clint chuckled. "If I spent my life worrying about who liked me, I wouldn't have made it past my first film. The only thing I ever cared about was telling the truth. And the truth doesn't always fit the narrative people want." The interview shattered records. Within hours, it had millions of views. People weren't just listening. They were rallying behind him. Hollywood might have dismissed Clint, but the people hadn't. The network, desperate to recover from their public blunder, reached out. A producer called Clint personally, offering him a chance to clarify his statements in a follow-up interview. A carefully controlled environment where he could smooth things over, maybe even walk back some of his harsher critiques. Clint didn't even hesitate. "No thanks," he said before hanging up. Instead, he did what he had always done. He got back to work. A month later, he announced his next project, an independent film, self-funded, no studio interference. A story about an aging lawman, the last of his kind, standing his ground in a world trying to erase him. Hollywood scoffed. They dismissed it as a vanity project, something that would fade into obscurity. But when the film was released, it became something more. It wasn't just a movie, it was a statement. Audiences packed theaters, critics, those who dared, acknowledged its raw power, and Clint proved one last time that you don't need Hollywood's approval to make something that matters. As the credits rolled on opening night, Clint Eastwood stepped out into the cool evening air. The storm had passed, but he hadn't just survived it. He had walked through it untouched. A younger man might have felt the need to gloat, to celebrate the victory. But Clint, he simply tipped his hat, got in his car, and rode off into the night. Because legends don't need validation, they just keep riding.